you get on that property, you can actually see the amphitheater because the roof burned off, and you can look down at the basement level now. It looks like some Greek ruin there in the New Mexico desert. But that was an amphitheater that was being used for secret briefings by DARPA. During that briefing in spring of 1971, Donald Rumsfeld stated that, as I'm sure you children are aware, the primary significance of teleportation is military. We found, studying World War II, that the greatest number of our troops weren't killed in combat. They were killed getting between back areas and the front lines. And so this technology will allow us to put troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield without endangering their lives. So it's clear that teleportation, the ability to open up these vortal tunnels and pass people through it, of course, carrying metal weapons would be a limit of that, but at least getting men in a location through vortal tunnels.
And then they can be shot. Right.
Right. Yeah, then they can be shot in the front
line.
Yeah,
exactly.
Conferred such military advantage that the military definitely didn't want it to become a public transportation modality, because then other countries would learn that we could do this on the battlefield. And in fact, if you universalize the technology, ultimately vortal tunnels could be opened up all over the place. So there was also the issue of social destabilization. Mm-hmm. I remember that the idea of organized criminal networks getting hold of teleportation was also something they wanted to control for. So it was clearly valuable as a military secret. It was viewed as socially destabilizing. There was some really informal think tank-like discussion when I was on the project about the fact that introducing such advanced technology would destabilize the current fossil fuel-based economy. But I think that was more than them just emulating what the eggheads were saying about the technology at that time. My father certainly believed, and I'm certainly trying to honor his memory and the generosity that he showed by involving me in these very important activities. He believed that teleportation should be used as the leading civilian transportation infrastructure, because you're jumping through a tunnel and popping out somewhere else, almost always uninjured, in several seconds, rather than hurtling through space, for example, in an automobile with 4,000 pounds of metal wrapped around you. That's not a very efficient means of getting from point A to point B. He definitely saw the value of what Dr. Ivan Browning spoke of when he was the director of science and technology when teleportation emerged, which is we have to stop thinking of getting somebody from point A to point B and start thinking of them stopping being at point A and starting being at point B.
Yeah.
So clearly it was sequestered because it was a valuable military technology. There was also the fact that obviously we have the governments of the world are essentially captured by the corporate sector that's substantially invested in anachronistic technologies. Yes. So there's a whole issue of developing a policy around technology transfer from transport based on the combustion of fossil fuels to Tesla-based superluminal vortal tunnel-based teleportation. That's a whole legal and economic and technical battle that's going to have to be won. I think in terms of chronovision is a threat primarily to privacy.
Yes.
I mean, all of us would want to see President Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address, but none of us necessarily would want to see him relieving himself or making love to his wife. So really the threat of chronovision is not, I mean, obviously the potential of it is to inspire the next generation of children with scenes of some of the great moments in human history. The downside is it threatens everybody's privacy who's ever lived and who is currently alive or who will ever be alive.
Yeah.
So unlike teleportation, which I think should be liberated and become the principal transportation modality, at least for long-distance travel, chronovision is a more inherently socially destabilizing phenomenon, and I'm calling for the development of a scientific protectorate that would be based at the National Archives of the United States, and they would release, let's say in concert with, I don't know, maybe DreamWorks or Disney or some major media concern, would create museums and libraries where select past events would be shown. You know, let's say a picture, at least from my country, let's say of George Washington standing on the dais when the U.S. Constitution is signed, and, you know, scenes of Benjamin Franklin there and so forth. I'm sure that people would become fascinated with the destiny of the human race and the effort to make a better world. Think of how inspired we are, for example, when you see Reverend King giving his I Have a Dream speech. imagine if you could go back in time and in a quantum access program under the National Archives, with leading historians serving as advisors, you captured these critical moments in human history. It would be utterly fascinating and inspiring. And so I think that would have to be handled that way.
Just one question here, Andrew. How about things in terms of socially destabilizing? If we talk about religion, for instance, if we can go back and look at certain characters in the religious world, if they really existed, what they really said, I mean, that would change things tremendously depending on, if it's accurate or not, correct?
It would, and I have specific information to share with you about that, so I hope you're sitting down.
Yes.
But during the latter part of my last summer in New Mexico on the project basis, this would have been where my dad and I teleported there. We spent time on like a linear B timeline, a different timeline, and at the end of the summer, we teleported back to the day we left in New Jersey and then lived the summer of 1972 over again. Okay. At that point, I had spent 3 years encompassing 4 basically hidden summers in New Mexico as a child participant on the project. According to my dad, I had done everything I'd been asked to do to the best of my ability. In fact, he said when they were testing me when I was teleporting there in 1970, I only got one problem wrong. It was the most difficult math problem that they threw at us. And so he wanted to give myself and his companion, Connie Chavez. My dad had a close friend named Connie Chavez who he met in Albuquerque when he was out at White Sands in 1953-54 flight testing the ramjet engine for Curtiss Wright. So she was a close personal friend of his over the years, and certainly by the time I was a kid on the project there, they were involved in an extramarital relationship with each other. And of course, my dad was in New Mexico via quantum displacement for 8 years, so you can understand how he sort of fashioned a second life for himself there in New Mexico. He would have had to, just to stay sane. Jeez. But anyway, Connie was a very close friend of his and became somewhat of my surrogate mother when I was in New Mexico for project purposes. And he treated us to something at the end of that summer. We went over to a room, not the auditorium, but another room at the Sandia National Labs. And we watched about 20 minutes of black and white documentary-like footage of a hologram in which the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth was shown. Mm-hmm. It was a very poor quality image. There was a lot of distortion of the light effect. But I know what Jesus looked like, and I certainly know how terribly he suffered being crucified. Connie was a devout Catholic and was literally practically squirming out of her seat. She could not watch it. And by then, let's see, that was summer of 72, so I was 10 going on 11, 10 and a half. I found it so disturbing to watch this individual being crucified that I almost felt like there was evil in the room, like there was an evil presence in the room. And I had difficulty watching it at times as well. And Jesus had dark hair and was very emaciated by the time he was crucified, but was essentially a European-looking man with slightly droopy eyes. Of course, he was dying and very thin. He had a crown of thorns, so he looked very much like some of the classical Renaissance depictions of him, certainly like the El Greco depiction of him. And you could see the thieves on the other crosses near him. The crosses were sort of like telephone pole-like with a small little crossbeam. He was sort of hanging from a small crossbeam and having his arms really spread out far, as I remember, about 14 feet off the ground. He was quite a distance off the ground. And I witnessed Longinus, the Roman soldier, piercing Jesus' side with the sword. In fact, Longinus almost leaped off the ground trying to get the spearhead up into his side. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it was very difficult footage to watch. Now that was imagery captured via quantum access that established that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure, as some researchers allege that Jesus was a legend or a myth or something. Right. Perhaps a character in a novel sponsored by the Piso family of Rome. Yeah. There are different theories establishing that Jesus may be the embodiment of a solar myth that predated him. Well, this was an individual from his era who was being crucified, and what we were watching followed the account that you find in the Gospels of his crucifixion. There were women who could be seen coming and praying beneath him. I remember the Roman centurions looked so silly because their skirts were actually quite short and effeminate looking. But nonetheless, I did see, Jesus' side being pierced. Now, my dad was a very hard-headed engineer.